The old town looked smaller than Jack Preston remembered, tired, almost frozen in time, as if it too had been waiting for him to come back. Gravel crunched beneath the tires of his rented car as he turned onto Maple Drive, the street where he had grown up, where every cracked sidewalk and sagging porch light seemed to whisper memories he had tried to forget. Jack hadn't set foot here in 10 years, not after the fight, not after the harsh words he could never take back. He had buried himself in the noise of city life, in endless work and hollow relationships, pretending he had no roots, no past worth returning to. But now, the past had come calling in the cruelest way. Margaret Preston was dead. Jack parked in front of the old 2-story house, its white paint now chipped and faded, the garden overgrown with stubborn weeds. His stomach twisted into knots as he stepped out into the chilly air. The house seemed to glare at him, an accusing monument to everything he had abandoned. Inside, it smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a scent so painfully familiar it nearly buckled his knees. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved through the narrow hallway, past the family pictures gathering dust. The smiling boy he once was, frozen in faded frames. In the living room, the funeral brochures lay in a neat pile on the coffee table, untouched, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to claim them. Jack barely glanced at them. His heart thudded heavily in his chest, weighed down not just by grief, but by a gnawing sense of unfinished business. He had thought he could come back, say a few hollow words, and leave again. But standing there, with the ghost of Margaret Preston in every corner, Jack realized something terrible. This house, this home, still held something for him. Something unfinished. Something waiting. And for the first time in years, Jack felt the first real pangs of fear, not of the past, but of what the past might reveal. Jack moved through the dim hallway like a ghost in someone else's memories. His mother's bedroom was just as she'd left it, the bed neatly made, the curtains slightly parted to let in a soft, mournful light. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, a warm, floral scent that struck him like a slap. For a moment, he couldn't move. The guilt crept up his spine, cold and choking. He didn't deserve to be here, not after 10 years of silence, not after choosing absence over apology. But grief doesn't care about guilt, it just lingers. As he sat on the edge of her bed, trying to catch his breath, Jack's eyes were drawn to a small wooden box on the nightstand. Not ornate, just old, with a brass latch dulled by time and fingerprints. It was out of place. Margaret had never been sentimental. She hated clutter, always preferring clean surfaces and tidy corners. But this box, it looked deliberate. With hesitant fingers, Jack opened it. Inside lay a single envelope, thick with folded pages, yellowed slightly at the edges. His name was written in his mother's unmistakable cursive. Jack. No dear, no date, just his name, underlined once. Beneath it, 3 words struck him harder than the funeral had. For when you're ready. His throat tightened. Ready? He didn't even know what ready meant anymore. Ready to grieve? To forgive? To regret everything? Hands trembling, Jack unfolded the letter. Margaret's voice rose off the page like a whisper from the grave. Not soft, but careful. Every word deliberate. She didn't begin with warmth. She began with truth. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you came back. Maybe too late, or maybe just in time. I kept things from you, Jack. Big things. Things that I thought would protect you, but I know now they've only hurt you in a different way. He paused, his vision blurring. The words didn't feel like an apology. They felt like a reckoning. There were more pages, dozens of them, it seemed. And Jack knew, before he'd even turned the first one, that his mother had left behind more than memories. She had left behind a secret, a truth she hadn't dared speak aloud. And whatever it was, it had waited in silence for a decade, just like this house, waiting for Jack to come home and finally hear it. Jack sat motionless at the edge of the bed, the letter heavy in his hands. The house creaked around him. Old wood shifting, whispering. But Jack barely heard it. The only sound was the thud of his heartbeat as he forced himself to keep reading. The opening paragraphs of Margaret's letter had been somber, almost cautious, But now her words sharpened into something raw and desperate, as if the truth she carried had weighed on her soul for years. "Jack, there's no easy way to tell you this, no way to soften it, and maybe I don't deserve your forgiveness for what I did. I was never supposed to be your mother." Jack froze, the words burning into him like acid. His mind recoiled, refusing to believe them, but his gut already knew. Something was wrong. Had always been wrong. He just hadn't dared name it before now. "You were born into a world that would have devoured you," she wrote. "I couldn't stand by and let that happen, so I did the unthinkable. I took you. I made you mine." Took him? Jack squeezed his eyes shut, a rush of anger, betrayal, confusion surging through him all at once. He tried to breathe, but the air felt thick and stale. Margaret described it in spare, brutal detail. A hospital room late at night, a moment when no one was watching, a choice made not out of madness, but out of fierce, feral love. She had stolen him not for herself, but to save him from a family whose name she would not yet reveal, a family whose darkness, she promised, would have destroyed him. "I tried to give you a better life. I tried to be enough." Jack dropped the letter onto the bedspread, his hands trembling. His entire life, every memory, every bond, suddenly felt built on a lie. Had he ever really been loved? Had Margaret ever seen him as her real son? Or just as a mission? A prize she had stolen? He looked around the room, at the worn quilt she had stitched by hand, at the photos still lining the dresser, at the battered rocking chair where she had read him bedtime stories. Margaret Preston might have been a thief, but she had also been a mother. His mother. And now, the only person who could explain everything was buried 6 feet under. The letter wasn't finished. There were more revelations still waiting for him, buried deeper in those crumpled pages. Jack gritted his teeth and turned to the next page. He had no choice now. He had already opened the door, and the truth was only just beginning to pour through. Jack sat alone in the dim living room, the letter spread out on the coffee table like a map to a life he had never known. As he turned the next page, Margaret's confession shifted from sorrow to warning. "Your father is still alive," she wrote, "but he is not the man you imagined when you were young. He is powerful, Jack, dangerously so. And if he ever knew you survived, he would destroy everything to keep his secrets buried." Jack swallowed hard, the name inked at the top of the next paragraph, igniting a memory he hadn't summoned in years. Edward Halston. It was a name Jack had heard before, whispered in news reports about real estate empires and political donations, always accompanied by sleek photographs of a man who seemed untouchable. Edward Halston wasn't just powerful. He was practically royalty in the world Jack had struggled to break into. And now Margaret was telling him that blood, that ruthless, golden blood, ran through his own veins. Margaret's words were urgent, almost frantic toward the end of the page, as if she had feared even writing them down. "He didn't want you, not because you weren't good enough, but because you were a threat. You were leverage someone could use against him, a weakness he couldn't afford. That's why I took you. To keep you from being erased, body and soul." Jack pressed his fists into his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the room felt like it was tilting. He thought back to all the times he had admired men like Halston from afar, wishing he belonged in that world of luxury and legacy, never knowing he already did. And worse, never knowing that world would have swallowed him whole. The fire of anger flickered to life inside him. All his years of struggle, his clawing climb through life, while the man whose blood he shared sat atop a golden empire. Edward Halston hadn't just abandoned Jack. He had tried to erase him, and Jack was beginning to realize someone, somewhere, might still be watching, still determined to keep the past buried, still willing to do anything to make sure Jack stayed forgotten. Outside, a cold wind howled against the window panes. Jack leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling, the letter heavy in his lap. He wasn't just fighting grief anymore. He was fighting a legacy of lies that was darker and more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The warmth of the evening sun had long since faded, and the cold of the night seemed to seep into Jack's bones as he stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the old house he'd once called home. The weight of the letter still pressed against his chest, gnawing at him like a festering wound that refused to heal. He wanted answers. He needed them. But the more he uncovered, the deeper the shadows grew. Just as Margaret's letter had warned him, there were forces at play. People Jack thought he could trust, people who should have been his allies, who had known the truth about his birth, about his bloodline, and had kept it hidden from him for years. It was one thing to learn that his biological father was an untouchable figure in the world of wealth and power, but it was something else entirely to realize that someone from his current life, someone he had trusted, had kept this secret from him. He paced across the room, restless as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. It was in the quiet, unexpected moments that the betrayal hit hardest. The familiar face that greeted him at the office every morning, the mentor who had always been there to offer advice, even the longtime friend who had been by his side through thick and thin, Jack now saw them through new, disbelieving eyes. How long had they known? How long had they been lying? The worst part wasn't that they'd hidden the truth from him. It was the fact that they'd allowed him to live a lie, to walk through life believing he was just another man struggling to carve out his place, when in reality, his true identity had been waiting for him like a loaded gun. It was Luke Chandler, his closest friend and confidant, the one person who had always seemed to understand the battle Jack had fought, who had betrayed him. Jack had known Luke for over a decade. They'd shared secrets, celebrated victories, even discussed dreams of the future. But now, all those conversations felt hollow. Every word Luke had ever said carried the weight of a hidden truth. Jack felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly tempered by the cold, suffocating realization that there was more at play here than personal betrayal. Luke wasn't the only one who had known. The web of deception was larger than he could have imagined, stretching out to people he thought were in his corner. He couldn't trust anyone. The familiar world he'd built for himself, his friends, his work, his life, had all been tainted. It wasn't just the distant figures of his biological family pulling strings behind the scenes. It was people he had trusted with his heart, his future. People who had kept him in the dark for their own gain, for their own reasons. In a moment of intense clarity, Jack understood that no one around him could be counted on. The truth about his birth, about who he really was, had the power to destroy everything, and someone had been willing to let that happen, willing to make sure he never found out. But why? And then, like a sudden thunderclap, a horrifying thought struck him. What if Luke wasn't the only one with something to hide? What if everyone who had known the truth had been playing their part in a game much darker than Jack could have ever imagined? The mansion loomed ahead like a monument to everything Jack had come to despise, a gleaming structure nestled at the heart of an exclusive estate, surrounded by wrought iron gates and manicured grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. This was the world he'd never known, the world that had claimed his birthright and stolen his future. But it was also the world he had been born into. The bloodline that ran through his veins was as old as it was corrupt. Jack had spent the last few days scouring through every scrap of information Margaret had left behind. Old newspapers, court documents, faded photographs that seemed to belong to someone else. And now he was staring down the legacy of that very bloodline, trying to comprehend what it meant, trying to understand who he was in a world that felt like a trap. Edward Halston, his biological father, was not just a businessman. He was the patriarch of a dynasty built on dirty deals, underhanded alliances, and a ruthless pursuit of power that left destruction in its wake. Jack had thought he had only been a forgotten son, discarded for the sake of preserving a perfect image, but the truth was worse than he could have ever imagined. Every scandal, every criminal activity, every illegal maneuver that had plagued the headlines, it had all been his family's doing. Halston's empire wasn't built on honest work or innovation, it was built on blood money, deceit, and manipulation. The people Jack had admired from afar, the ones who seemed to hold the keys to wealth and influence, had been complicit in a game of corruption that had ruined lives for generations. The names he saw in the news, politicians, judges, executives, they were all connected to his family in one way or another. They were either puppets or puppet masters, all tied to the Halston fortune in some way. But there was something more insidious at play here. These weren't just powerful figures. They were connected by a web of lies so intricate that Jack couldn't even begin to untangle it all. He'd been born into this cesspool of greed and manipulation, and his very existence had been a threat to its delicate balance. The worst part, Jack realized, was that there was nothing noble about it, no reason to glorify this legacy. These weren't kings or heroes, they were criminals, pure and simple. And he was the product of that darkness, a living reminder of everything they'd done to stay in control. Jack leaned over a wooden desk, sifting through documents that had been hidden away by people who thought they could control his past. There were more names on the pages now, faces that were too familiar to ignore, business partners, friends of his father, people who had profited from the pain of others. He didn't have to read all the documents to understand the kind of power they wielded, the kind of power that could ruin lives with a single phone call. His body went cold. What did this mean for him? Was he just another pawn in their game, meant to be controlled or discarded like everything else they'd touched? Or was there a place for him in this empire, a role to play that would give him the power he had always craved? Jack's thoughts swirled in a dizzying spiral. The truth he'd uncovered was like a poison that seeped into every corner of his life, twisting his identity into something unrecognizable. Margaret had tried to save him, that much was clear. But now, as Jack stood on the precipice of his own future, he realized that this truth wasn't just about betrayal. It was about choosing which part of himself he would honor, the son Margaret had raised, or the heir to a legacy of lies and corruption. In the silence of that mansion, with its cold marble floors and distant echoes of power, Jack Preston was beginning to understand the true cost of his birthright. There was no redemption in this world, no way to escape the shadows of his father's sins. He could either walk away and lose everything or step into the darkness and take what was rightfully his, but at what cost? Jack had never known his mother to be anything but a woman of quiet strength, a protector, a provider, a woman who carried herself with grace despite the hardships life had thrown her way. But as he dug deeper into the wreckage of her past, Jack found a different side to Margaret, a side that, until now, had remained locked away behind years of secrets, silence, and sacrifice. The hidden files Margaret had left behind weren't just about Jack's birth. They weren't just confessions about the family he had never known. They were letters, journals, and personal notes, each one telling a piece of a story that Jack had never imagined. The more he read, the clearer it became. Margaret's decision to take him had been no mere act of rebellion against a cold-hearted man who had cast him aside. It was an act of desperation, an act of survival in a world where Jack's life was nothing more than a currency to be bought and sold by people who had no regard for human decency. Margaret's journals, written in a hurried, trembling hand, revealed the truth. Jack had been meant to be a pawn in a much larger game, one of wealth, control, and manipulation. His biological father, Edward Halston, had never intended to raise Jack. He had seen the boy as nothing more than a tool to further his empire, a child to be molded into a weapon, to be used to settle old debts and claims, to strengthen the Halston name for the next generation. Margaret's decision had been a gut-wrenching one. She had taken Jack to protect him, but she had done so knowing the cost. The cost of living with the knowledge that the people who would love and care for him, the people who would call him family, would never truly be his own. She had given up her own life to shield him from the monstrous world that awaited him. The most painful part? Margaret had known from the very beginning that her actions would lead to a lifetime of guilt. She would never be able to fully give Jack the life he deserved. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not in full, not while he was still young. Not while the danger of the Halston family still hung over their heads like a guillotine waiting to fall. But it wasn't just the pain of her sacrifice that haunted Margaret. It was the fact that she had done it alone. She had no one to turn to, no one to help her. The Halstons had powerful reach, and they had made sure that any attempt to reach out for help would be crushed before it even began. No one could ever know the full truth, not without endangering Jack's life. In one of the final entries, Margaret's voice broke through, a mixture of guilt and love. I didn't want you to grow up hating me, but I couldn't bear the thought of you becoming a part of his world. You deserve more than that, Jack. You deserve a life of peace, not one built on lies and manipulation. I took you because I knew that the day you learned the truth, it would destroy everything we had. But I had to take that risk. I had to save you." The last sentence struck Jack like a punch to the gut. I had to save you. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the world around him faded. Margaret had saved him from a life of corruption, a life where he would have been nothing more than a tool in a corrupt empire's game. She had stolen him. Yes, but not for selfish reasons. She had stolen him to give him a chance at something better, to let him live without becoming a monster. Jack's heart twisted with a mix of gratitude and anger. Gratitude for the mother who had loved him fiercely, even if it meant living in the shadow of guilt and fear. Anger at the life he might have had, the future that had been ripped away from him before he could even understand it. As he sat alone, surrounded by Margaret's memories, the enormity of her sacrifice began to settle deep within him. She had chosen to live with the weight of this secret for years, even if it meant a lifetime of pain. Even as she had watched him grow, she could never share the truth, never tell him the full story of who he was and who they were running from. In a way, Jack realized she had given up everything for him, her future, her peace of mind, her own happiness, all so he could have a chance at something better, so he could have a chance at life. The moment Jack received the call, everything seemed to slow down. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, as if it were trying to lull him into a decision he hadn't yet made. The invitation was simple, the offer deceptively alluring. Come meet with his biological family, the Halstons. It was time for Jack to take his rightful place in the empire that was his inheritance. But Jack couldn't escape the feeling that everything about this moment was suffocating. He'd spent so many days now uncovering the twisted roots of his past, only to have it all laid bare before him, a shadowy inheritance that felt like a chain around his neck. Was it really his birthright to claim, or was this simply the final stage of a life that had been predestined for him, long before he could make his own choices? He sat in the same small apartment he had lived in for the last few years, far from the world of his true family, a world he had thought was a distant fantasy, something he could only glimpse from a distance. The thought of stepping into that world, of becoming a part of it, was overwhelming. And yet, the invitation tugged at him like a siren song. The Halston name meant power. It meant wealth. It meant a life of untold luxury. No more struggling, no more scraping by, no more second-guessing. With one decision, Jack could reclaim everything that had been taken from him, the resources to fight back, to right the wrongs, to take control of the life that had been stolen. He could be someone, finally, no longer a man defined by the lies he'd been fed, but a man who had the power to shape the world to his own design. But there was another side to this inheritance, something darker and more sinister. The Halston name wasn't just built on wealth and success. It was built on manipulation, on exploitation, on corruption that reached every corner of the world. The family had thrived at the expense of countless others, leaving destruction in their wake. Jack had seen it all in the files Margaret had left behind, the endless parade of dirty deals, the lives that had been crushed under the weight of their ambitions. He knew that joining them meant embracing that legacy, becoming a cog in a machine that would stop at nothing to maintain its grip on power. Jack's mind was a battlefield, torn between the two paths that lay before him. On one hand, he could stand tall in the Halston Empire, becoming the heir they had always intended him to be. He could wield his father's power and make his mark on the world. On the other hand, he could turn his back on it all, reject the life they had planned for him, and honor the woman who had protected him from that very fate. The choice was both simple and impossible. With every hour that passed, Jack felt the pressure building, a weight that threatened to crush him. He had always prided himself on making his own way in the world, on building his own success. But none of that mattered now. He wasn't just Jack Preston, a man trying to rise from humble beginnings. He was Jack Halston, son of a ruthless billionaire, heir to a legacy that had the power to reshape the world in ways he couldn't even fathom. The temptation was undeniable. Who wouldn't want power, wealth, influence? The Halstons could offer him everything he had ever dreamed of, everything he'd fought for, but could never quite attain. And yet, when he thought about it, Jack could feel the sting of betrayal. His mother had sacrificed everything to keep him safe from this world, to protect him from becoming just another tool in their game. Would he really throw that away? His heart clenched as he thought of Margaret. She had given up her own happiness for him, sacrificing her future to shield him from the horrors of a life he hadn't even known existed. Could he really betray her now after all she'd done to protect him? In the hours that followed, Jack began to realize that this wasn't just a decision about wealth or power. It wasn't about building an empire or avenging the past. It was about who he wanted to be. The man who stepped into the Halston name would be forever tied to the sins of the past. The man who walked away would carry the weight of the choices made, not just for himself, but for Margaret, for the woman who had given him the life he had known. The invitation to the Halston estate had been sent, but Jack wasn't sure if he was ready to accept it. Would he accept the dangerous inheritance that awaited him? Or would he walk away from it all, preserving the memory of the mother who had saved him? Jack stood at the edge of the Halston estate, his heart pounding in his chest. The gates loomed in front of him, as imposing as they were elegant. Inside these walls lay everything he had once thought he wanted: power, wealth, influence. But now it felt like a trap, an inescapable web woven with lies, greed, and betrayal. The decision he had been avoiding had finally come to a head. The Halstons had extended the olive branch, inviting him into their world. They were ready to welcome him with open arms, as though nothing had ever stood between them. But Jack knew better. He had spent too many nights digging through Margaret's journals, her letters, her files, to ignore the truth that had come crashing into his life. The Halston family wasn't just rich and powerful, they were corrupt, with fingers in every illegal scheme imaginable, a legacy built on stolen lives and destroyed dreams. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about what it cost to gain that power, the lives that had been shattered to build it. Jack knew it, he had seen it firsthand. The more he learned, the more he realized. If he stepped into this world, he would be complicit. He would be taking his place in a dynasty that had destroyed everyone who crossed it. But there was another side to the story. He had a chance, a real chance, to rewrite the narrative. He could expose the Halstons for what they truly were. He could bring their crimes into the light and tear down the empire they had built on blood and lies. It would be the right thing to do, the honorable thing. People would be freed from their influence. The world would finally see them for what they were: monsters, not men. Yet, the thought of betraying everything Margaret had sacrificed for him felt like a dagger to his heart. Jack remembered her final letter, her words echoing in his mind. "I saved you from this world because I loved you. Don't let it consume you like it did me." She had given up her own life, her safety, her peace, to keep him away from this nightmare. She had protected him, even though it meant living with a secret so heavy that it threatened to crush her every day. And now, Jack was on the precipice of dishonoring her sacrifice. If he exposed the Halstons, if he took them down, he would be risking everything. The love, the warmth, the protection Margaret had given him would be tainted by the truth of what she had done to protect him. He couldn't bear the thought of that. But there was more at stake now, more than just his own feelings. The Halstons were dangerous. If he chose silence, if he chose loyalty to his mother's memory, he would be allowing their reign to continue, giving them permission to destroy more lives, to keep building their empire on the backs of the innocent. The pressure mounted. Every inch of the estate felt like a claustrophobic cage closing in on him. The choice was no longer about what he wanted, it was about what was right. Jack walked the grounds in a haze, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every step felt heavier than the last. As he passed the marble statues, the manicured gardens, the glittering windows of the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a lion's den, a place where, once inside, he would never be able to escape. Inside, the Halstons were waiting, the family that should have been his. But Jack knew that they were nothing like the family he had always dreamed of. The image of his biological father, Edward Halston, a man who had built his fortune on the backs of the broken, was now a specter that haunted every step he took. Edward had never wanted him, never cared about him. To him, Jack was just another tool to be used in his quest for dominance, nothing more. But still, the allure of the power, the promise of a life without limits, was undeniable. He could take it all, everything he'd ever wanted, all the riches, all the influence, all the control. Yet as Jack reached the front doors, the sound of his mother's voice in his head became louder. "You deserve more than this, Jack. You deserve a life of peace, a life away from their darkness." The thought of Margaret's love, her sacrifice, gave him the strength he needed to face what was ahead. He had to decide once and for all. Would he honor her memory, her love, and her sacrifice, or would he let the Halston legacy consume him as it had everyone else? As Jack's hand hovered over the doorbell, he realized the truth. There was no easy answer, no perfect choice. He would either betray everything he had learned to protect, or he would live the rest of his life carrying the guilt of having let these people continue their reign of terror. The doorbell rang. The mansion's grand entrance loomed ahead, its polished marble floors and soaring columns a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Jack's chest. He had made his choice, or so he thought. The decision to confront Edward Halston, to lay the sins of the family bare for all to see, had been bubbling inside him ever since the moment he stepped through the gates. But now, as he stood on the precipice of his final confrontation, Jack realized that the truth was far more complicated than he could ever have imagined. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the vast hallways as he made his way toward the grand library where Edward waited. The walls were lined with books and rare artifacts, evidence of the Halston family's power and influence stretching across generations. Every inch of this place reminded Jack of the legacy that had been built on manipulation, on control, a legacy that he had never asked for, but that had been thrust upon him the moment he was born. As he entered the library, he saw Edward Halston sitting at the far end, a commanding figure bathed in the golden light pouring through the tall windows. Edward's icy blue eyes flicked up from his papers as Jack approached, his expression unreadable. For all the anger Jack had felt toward this man, he couldn't ignore the small flicker of recognition in Edward's gaze. There was something there, something that couldn't be ignored, a flicker of the father Jack had never known, but always longed for. "Jack," Edward's voice was calm, almost welcoming. "I've been expecting you." Jack stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. "Expecting me?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "For what? To join you? To follow in your footsteps?" Edward's lips curved into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I've given you everything, Jack. I've made sure you had every opportunity to rise to your full potential. The Halston name is one of power. All you have to do is accept it." Jack's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I didn't ask for any of this. You took me away from the only family that cared about me, and for what? To turn me into you?" Edward's smile faded, his gaze hardening. "I did what I had to do to protect you, from your mother. From the lies she told you. She was never going to be able to give you what you needed. I saw your potential long before she ever did. You were meant for greatness, Jack. Don't you see that?" Jack took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "I know exactly who you are. You think you can control everything, that your money and power give you the right to shape people's lives however you see fit. But I'm not your pawn. I'm not your heir. I'm nothing like you." Edward's eyes narrowed, a flash of something dark crossing his features. "You don't understand, Jack. I'm giving you everything you've ever wanted. The power, the legacy, the wealth. You can have it all. All you have to do is take your place." Jack's breath caught in his throat as a memory flashed through his mind. His mother's face, her words etched in his soul. "Don't let them take you, Jack. Don't let them use you like they've used everyone else." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The anger he had felt, the resentment that had simmered inside him for so long, all of it now seemed so small in the face of the truth. Edward Halston wasn't just a man with power. He was a predator, and Jack had been his prey from the moment he was born. Jack's voice was steady but filled with a cold fury. "I'm not going to play your game, Edward. I'm not going to let you manipulate me into becoming the monster you are." Edward's expression shifted from cold to calculating. "You think you can just walk away from this? From everything I've given you? From the future you're meant to have? You'll regret this, Jack. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for. But Jack wasn't listening anymore. The decision had been made. He wasn't going to let this man, this legacy of corruption and lies, control him any longer. He wasn't going to be a part of this world, not when he had finally seen the cost of it, the people it had ruined, the lives it had shattered. You've already lost, Jack said quietly, his words carrying the weight of finality. And I'm not going to be part of your empire. I'm walking away. For a moment, there was a silence that hung between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Edward's lips curled into a sinister grin, a grin that made Jack's blood run cold. You think you can walk away? You think you can expose me? Ruin everything I've built? Edward's voice dropped to a low growl. I've been watching you, Jack. You're nothing more than a pawn in my game, and I've let you believe you had control. But you don't. You never did. Before Jack could react, a sharp pain exploded in his chest. He looked down in disbelief to find a letter opener, gleaming with fresh blood, lodged deep in his side. Edward's face was twisted in cold amusement. I let you think you were free, Jack, but you never were. No one walks away from the Halstons. Jack staggered back, his vision blurring as his body fought to stay conscious. He collapsed to the ground, the weight of betrayal crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The man he had called his father, the man who had promised him everything, had just torn his world apart in an instant. As the darkness closed in, Jack's last thoughts were of Margaret, the mother who had saved him from this world, from this legacy. Her love had been his only refuge, and now, in his final moments, he knew that her sacrifice had been worth it. He hadn't become the monster his father wanted. He had chosen something else. He had chosen to walk away. The world went black,